briefly, I'm an associate professor of international relations and Gulf studies here at the School of International Relations of Ca' Foscari University of Venice. So today we are here, we have for an exceptional occasion, so I want to thank all of you for coming. I also want to thank the Fondazione Università Ca' Foscari and the Gulf Research Center Foundation for the sponsorship of this series of events. And as you know, this is one of our series on the Middle East, and more specifically on the let's say, on the debris of the Arab Spring. I don't know how you want to put it, but we'll see. Today we have two exceptional guests, and let me introduce them briefly. We are very lucky to have Professor Mark Lynch, Associate Professor at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and also, crucially, the director of POMEX, the Project on Middle East Political Science. Professor Lynch and I go back a long time. We first met in 1998, so it's a long time ago. I was still an undergrad at an excellent MESA conference in Chicago on alliances in the Middle East. And in addition to his fine scholarship, what we are all thankful for when it comes to Professor Lynch is the fact that he has actually done something that people have been talking about for many, many years, but nobody had had the energy and resourcefulness to implement. Namely, he put in touch the community of political scientists dealing with the Middle East with decision makers in Washington, D.C. And we all hope that this is going to have a mitigating effect on American Middle East policy, or in any case, it's a very enriching effect for both decision makers and political scientists. So, like, the entire scholarly community is very, very thankful to him for his tireless work on the as director of POMEX. Our second guest this afternoon is equally exceptional. His name is Lorenzo Cremonesi. He is the special correspondent of Corriere della Sera, the major and most prestigious Italian daily, dealing mostly but not only with the Middle East. And personally, at least from a virtual point of view, my acquaintance with Lorenzo Cremonesi goes back even longer than the one with Professor Lynch, because I remember when I was still in high school, and I bought his book on Zionism and the origins of kibbutz. That was, I think, probably the first book on the Middle East I've ever read cover to cover. So Lorenzo Cremonesi is not only, as you know him, an exceptionally gifted journalist, but he's also a scholar in his own right. And I couldn't think of a better person to converse with Professor Lynch afterwards in following the presentation. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Mark Lynch to Venice and to our university. Thanks again.
Thank you. And first of all, of course, I'd like to thank Professor Logrenzi for his gracious hospitality here in Venice, and Lorenzo for joining me on this program. And it is a great pleasure and a great honor to be able to address this audience and to be here in Venice to speak about what's happening in the Middle East today. And it's interesting, as I listened to Matteo describe me, I hardly recognized the person, but it is interesting that the way that I have experienced the Arab Spring and the events that I'm about to describe to you is one that I've come from multiple perspectives. And at one level, I approach these events as an academic. I've been a student of the Middle East for some number of decades, and I've been traveling to the region and writing books and academic articles, and so part of me looks at what happens in Tahrir Square or in Damascus and sees it from an analytical perspective, sees it in terms of theories and sees it in terms of the kinds of conceptual understandings of the region which we've been using for so many decades. But at the same time, I also also approach it as something of a participant observer, if you will. As a blogger, I've had a blog on Middle East politics called Abu Aardvark, it's a strange name, but it's a blog that I've been running for over 10 years, and for the last 4 years it's been on Foreign Policy magazine, and where I edit the Middle East channel. And in that capacity, I've been both something of a journalist. I'm nothing like Lorenzo, but I have been something of a journalist. But more importantly, I've been a participant observer in the evolution of the online Arab political universe. One of the great honors that I ever got was a few years ago. There was a list of the top 20 Arab political bloggers, and they put me on the list. I don't know if I belonged there or not, but simply being treated as an Arab blogger by Arab bloggers was to me a great honor, and it helps to give you perhaps some sense of how I'm approaching the events that I'm about to describe. And those events are what you've read about in the media, what we've described as the Arab Spring, what I prefer to call, as in my book, the Arab uprisings. But the enormously surprising and stunning events which begin in the beginning of 2011 and have so radically reshaped the politics of the region. And I think that, at least from the view from Washington and the view from much of the region, and I think most of you would agree, that this has gone through at least 2 clear phases already. A period of enormous excitement. I remember very vividly on January 25th, 2011, watching the crowds pouring into Tahrir Square, watching something happen which in many ways we had been waiting for and hoping for, but never really believing would happen, suddenly manifesting before our eyes, seeing the hundreds of thousands of people coming into the streets, sticking to a nonviolent strategy, and demanding the downfall of the regime of Hosni Mubarak. Now, for this to happen on that day was something which few of us believed could ever have happened. And as you all know, in the 18 days which followed, in where you saw the refusal of the people to leave the square and the various attempts to try and find ways to satisfy them short of Mubarak's departure, eventually failing and Mubarak leaving. All, certainly not peacefully, over 1,000 people died, but without widespread use of violence by the opposition and without the army using its crushing force to empty the square. This was something which created, I think, a very new image of what was possible in the Middle East. We had just finished more than a decade of war, and what we saw in the region was mostly extremism, violence, Al-Qaeda, terrorism, the failure of the peace process, and basically the image that most Americans, I can't speak for Italians, but the image that most Americans had of the Middle East by 2011 was one of a violent place where change seemed impossible, where extremists dominated, and where it seemed very difficult to imagine a democratic future. And suddenly, in 18 days in Egypt, we could suddenly imagine something different. People could look at the activists, the leaders of Tahrir Square, and they could identify with them. They could see people like us, people who wanted democracy, people who were not violent, people who spoke English, and who were on Facebook and Twitter, and who could be followed, and you could form virtual relations with. And I think that that moment was crucial not only for what happened in Egypt, but for how the entire world began to think about Egypt and about the region as a whole. Now, all of you are here because you follow the news, you care about the Middle East, so you know that that didn't last. And now, I think, the bookend of the hope for peaceful change in Egypt is what we see in Syria today, with this almost incomprehensible human suffering, war and violence on a scale which by some measures even dwarfs Iraq, which is comparable to some of the worst conflicts in Africa in the last decades, where we have, by conservative estimates, well over 100,000 dead, millions of refugees and internally displaced, and an entire region seemingly destabilized. And I think that more broadly, people look around the region, they see not only Syria, but they also see political stagnation and failure in Egypt. with the Islamists rising to power through elections, with clashes in the streets, with the frustration of the secular activists and growing polarization. And they see the hopes of Tahrir Square seeming to disappear. You look at Tunisia, and you still see polarization and frustration and continuing economic problems. You look at Libya, and you see what appears to be an ungoverned country where the institutions are not forming, where the militias still control the streets. And for America, the murder of our ambassador in September was a truly stunning moment to see a country that we had helped to liberate, to see the body of the man most closely identified from an American point of view with this new Libya being killed and his body dragged in the street. This was something which cast a very deep and very enduring negative image of the change. Across the region, I think it's fair to say that the trajectory has been quite negative. So you had negative views of the region for a decade, punctuated by wild enthusiasm, as suddenly there's this great hope for change everywhere, and then it comes crashing down to the earth. And I think that now it's fair to say, and public opinion polls in the United States at least demonstrate this, people are more pessimistic about the future of the Middle East today than they were before January 25th. They're less likely to believe that democracy is possible. They're more likely to believe that change is impossible. And when they do believe that change is possible, that large majorities believe that this will be negative, that it will have negative implications for the United States and for the people of the region. And that's, I think, the general way people think about the Middle East today, at least in the broader public. I don't agree with this, and I'll tell you the reason why. The reason is that I see what happened January 25th and in the months which followed not as a unique moment which came from nowhere, but instead as one moment in a longer term, much deeper structural change in the nature of politics in the region. January 25th at Tahrir Square did not come out of nowhere. Many people like to equate what happens in the Middle East to what happened in Eastern Europe after the fall of communism in 1989, where you have suddenly these revolutions out of nowhere, where nobody could possibly have seen this coming, and then out of nowhere, huge numbers of people come into the streets. That is not what happened in most of the Middle East in 2011. Quite the contrary. In fact, what had been happening in the Middle East for at least 15 years had been a long and deep transformation of the nature of politics in the region. One in which was accompanied by a rising wave of popular protest and popular dissent, which had people out in the streets protesting in most countries of the region at various moments over the course of a decade. What made January 25th extraordinary is not that people protested, it's that they won. Before that, there had been protests everywhere, but they always lost. And at the time that people went into the streets on January 25th, they didn't expect to win. They had never won. It never occurred to them that they would win. And when they did, they didn't know what to do with their victory. They didn't know how to proceed from their successful overthrow of an authoritarian regime because that had not even been in the realm of imagination before. But it's crucial to understand that the act of protest, popular mobilization, popular movements, these were things that had been developing for well over a decade. I would say that to understand what's happening in the Middle East right now, you have to go back to what things looked like in, say, 1985, probably when I started studying the region, when Lorenzo started reporting from the region. At that time, most Arab countries were virtually devoid of public politics. There was no politics because there was such tight government control over every aspect of public performance and the possibility of political participation. Even in the supposedly liberal countries, such as Jordan, an ally of the United States, always described as moderate, there was almost absolute government control over political behavior. Pervasive intelligence apparatus, which would be sure to monitor every possible manifestation of politics. someone looking over your shoulder, listening in on every conversation. Those of you who are old enough to have traveled through the region in those days, I'm sure every one of you who's done that would have the experience of being in a luxury hotel, picking up the International Herald Tribune or some other foreign newspaper, opening it up, and finding an article cut out, literally with scissors. The intelligence services would go, and they would cut these things out with scissors. Governments controlled the media. They controlled the newspapers. They controlled the television stations. They were able to control, in an almost unbelievable way, the flow of information and the expression of opinion. When Iraq invaded Kuwait in August of 1990 and massed his troops on the border of Saudi Arabia, the vast majority of the citizens of Saudi Arabia didn't even know it had happened for 4 days, because the Saudi royal family didn't quite know what they were going to do, and they wanted to prevent their citizens from getting any bad ideas, so they simply prevented knowledge of what had happened, and they were able to do it. Censorship of the newspapers, control of the media, and for people who wanted to get information out, this pervasive system of intelligence and secret police and control over society, so that if you were enough, and of course there were some people brave enough to try and dissent, they would immediately disappear into the dungeons, tortured, often killed, their families killed, tortured, expelled from their jobs, their passports confiscated, all manner of things which repressive regimes do to prevent the circulation of ideas. And the important thing to understand is that up until the late 1980s, nearly 2 decades of such pervasive control had shaped and dominated political culture. It was difficult to have political conversations in those days, in Jordan, in Syria, certainly in Iraq, but even in Egypt, because of the pervasiveness of control and government domination of information. This begins to change in the 1990s with the advent of satellite television and also satellite printing of newspapers. You begin to see in the early 1990s the emergence of relatively independent newspapers, mostly Saudi-owned, like Al-Hayat and Al-Sharq Al-Awsat, which were slightly more open in their political coverage and in their editorializing. You began to see the emergence of some Arab pay-to-view news channels, again, often owned by the Gulf, in the early to mid-1990s. Again, slightly more liberal, slightly more open. But the big change comes with the rise of widespread, often illegal ownership of satellite dishes, and then the launch in late 1996 of Al Jazeera, the Qatari television station, which was free to view and adopted an extremely unusual approach to covering politics, i.e., they covered it. They actually reported on everything in a professional manner from every Arab country. They hosted talk shows where they would get representatives of all different sides and have them argue, often in extremely entertaining, nasty, violent ways, the violence of the talk show studio. And this was revolutionary simply because it showed that disagreement was not only possible, but was actually desirable. And a new generation begins to experience politics where you get the normalization of dissent, the normalization of argument, and the expectation that this would be done in public. By the late 1990s, Al Jazeera had become the de facto television station of the entire Arab world. And when I say that it was widely followed, I don't know the Italian television system well enough to know if this translates, but in the United States, when people talk about, Fox News is the most watched television station, they have something like 5% market share, whereas something like, American Idol or something like that might get up to 40 or 50%. In the Arab world, to the best of our ability to measure, Al Jazeera had a market share of 50 to 60%, i.e. it was being watched as much as or more than the most popular entertainment shows. Literally everybody was watching it, and if they hadn't, they would assume that everybody was. You would walk into cafes, and people would be talking about what they argued about on an Al Jazeera talk show the night before. Al Jazeera, at the time, was the property of Qatar, as it is today. But back then, Qatar was nothing. It had no foreign policy, nobody cared about it, it had no real agenda other than having Al Jazeera put Qatar on the map. Which meant that it was relatively independent of the usual power politics, and it presented itself as the voice of the Arab street. It presented itself as a pan-Arab unifying force, very self-conscious in its presentation. And when it reported on local issues, it would present them as part of a pan-Arab story. So when they reported on an election in Egypt, they would report it in such a way that a Yemeni or a Tunisian understood that this was part of a shared Arab struggle for democracy. Elections in Morocco mattered to someone in Yemen. It should matter, it does matter, and people came to believe that it did. And this is important because this then creates a couple of things which are extremely important for understanding the Arab Spring. The unification of Arab political space and the shattering of the ability of governments to control information. Those two things were central to the structural transformation that I'm talking about. Now this begins in the late 1990s. What happens over the course of the 2000s? What I would describe is a period over the course of the 2000s where you see an ever-increasing zone of popular discourse, of public critique and rising transparency, coupled in varying degrees in different countries with a rising wave of popular protest and popular mobilization. Now the story that this very short version of the story I'm about to tell will focus on Egypt because it's so important. But you have to remember that you saw a massive emergence of popular mobilization around human rights in Bahrain. You saw street protests in Kuwait in 2006. You saw protests in various places in Jordan. You saw protests in a large number of Arab countries. But Egypt is the most striking. Since I began with Tahrir Square, Egypt is the place to begin. In Egypt, the wave of protest that culminates in Tahrir Square begins in 2000, 11 years before, when you saw protests about the Israeli reoccupation of the West Bank and the Al-Aqsa Intifada. Groups of people came out, tolerated by the government because the Mubarak he didn't mind if people protested as long as it was only on foreign policy issues. And they came out and they protested. They protested again in 2002. They protested against the United States and the war on terror. They protested in one of the largest protests in Egyptian history against the American invasion of Iraq in 2003. And then key organizers of those protests decided to turn their attention inwards and to begin protesting against Hosni Mubarak, and specifically against his plan to have his son Gamal succeed him as the next president, which really, it's a republic. You're not supposed to have your son succeed you. And this was actually seen as quite offensive by many Egyptians. It was also the case that Hosni Mubarak's son Gamal was the symbol in popular discourse of a certain kind of politics. This rising new class of neoliberal elites, people who had become fabulously wealthy by enjoying kind of a privileged access to capital. People who had been able to, basically they were perceived as extremely corrupt, using nepotism and connections to the military and to the presidency to enrich themselves at the expense of Egyptians. He was the symbol of that in the eyes of most Egyptians. In 2004, the Kafaya movement begins going into the streets in very small numbers, and they begin demonstrating against Gamal's succession. Their symbol, their slogan, Kafaya, it means enough. And what they would do, this is extremely interesting when you start thinking about it, is that they only had maybe 50 or 100 people showing up at a protest. But what they had was blogs and connections to journalists. So they would do a protest with 50 people on a street corner. They would take their pictures and upload them to their blogs. And they would make sure that the Al Jazeera cameraman was on their speed dial, so he would show up and take footage of them before the secret police could come and arrest them all. To the outside world, it looked like there were tens of thousands of Egyptians protesting, even if there were only 20 or 30 on a street corner. If they had done the same thing 5 years earlier, they would have been 20 or 30 people on a street corner. They would have been arrested, disappeared, and nobody would have had the slightest idea that they had ever existed. But the new media allowed them to have much greater power than they would have before. To fast forward, this then evolves in a rolling series of protests and demonstrations over the course of the decade. Labor activists, judges, human rights activists, students, university professors. I think it's fair to say that by the time you get to 2010, there was almost no sector of Egyptian society that hadn't been demonstrating or protesting. By one count, there were over 1 million labor demonstrations and strikes in Egypt in the decade preceding 9/11, or the Tahrir Square. So the point is that Egypt, by the time you get January 25th, was a society in turmoil. What's more, the way that things were developing in Egypt were such that you were seeing basically the disappearance of the middle class and vast increase in poverty at the exact same time that there was more transparency than ever before. People couldn't not know what was going on. They couldn't not see that bridges were collapsing, trains were turning over with no one being punished, ferry boats capsizing with no punishment. And at the same time, politics went on as usual. To me, a highly symbolic moment in the middle of the decade was when the Parliament building burned down and almost no one noticed, because politics had become so irrelevant to their lives. And so formal politics, governance, institutions are all collapsing. But popular mobilization is growing, transparency is growing, and this was unsustainable. The punchline of all of this, where I'm going to end this in about 20 minutes, is simply to say that this long-term trend is the reason that we are never going back to the way politics were in the Middle East before. The ups and downs of Egypt, Syria, various countries that I'm going to talk about now are interesting and important, but structurally irrelevant. I mean, not irrelevant, that's a little extreme, but they're much less important than this broader structural change. The fundamental political culture of the Arab world has changed, and it's impossible to go back. Where it goes is a different question, but we're not going back to the way things were before. Okay, let me now talk briefly about the specific features of the so-called Arab Spring and kind of how it gets to where we are today. First of all, I would say that even though I don't like the term, I do think that the Arab Spring as a concept is useful because it demarcates a specific moment in time which lasted about 2 months and in which there was a unique set of dynamics. It begins with the downfall of President Ben Ali in Tunisia in the middle of January, and it ends in roughly the middle of March of 2011. In that period, there was what I would call an unbelievable, extraordinary moment of enthusiasm across the entire Arab world. One in which people came to believe that change was not only possible, but inevitable. So I'm not going to go into the details of a lot of countries because I think we'll talk about those in the discussion. But the key thing is that nobody saw Tunisia coming. I'm willing to admit that I didn't predict it. Nobody predicted Tunisia. Tunisia came out of nowhere and took everyone by surprise. But Tunisia is on the margins of Arab politics. It's the farthest west. It had no media presence. It was strategically irrelevant to the great issues of the Middle East, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the wars in Iraq. Nobody cared about Tunisia from a strategic point of view. But Tunisia was covered heavily by Al Jazeera, and it picked up enormous traction on social media, on Facebook, on Twitter, on the blogs, and it was portrayed in those media as part of this broader Arab story. As I was describing before with Al Jazeera, this translates into the experience of Tunisia. When Ben Ali flees on January 10th, this was important because it was the first time that Arabs could see popular mobilization succeeding. And this is really, really important. Again, protests have been everywhere. Tunisia itself had protests in the south of the country every couple of years. It was kind of a tradition. Egypt, all these other countries had lots of protests. But when the students and the workers and the protesters occupied the Bourguiba streets in central Tunis, and the army refused to open fire, and Ben Ali fled, this created an expectation across the region that change had now suddenly become possible. If you weren't following it at the time, it's almost impossible to repeat that experience. But those of you who were following it, remember it. This sense of unbelievable excitement. And again, not in Tunisia, but every place else in the Arab world. Every single country in the Arab world had the same thing happening. The public was saying, can we be next? And the governments were saying, no, you can't be next. And basically, you have what I call kind of almost like a phony war for 11 days, where everybody is wondering, can Yemen be next? Can Bahrain be next? Can Syria be next? Can Egypt be next? Everybody was watching and waiting. January 25th, the activists go out into the streets, and it's very important to remember this. When they went out into the streets on January 25th, they did not take Hosni Mubarak by surprise. It was advertised on Facebook. The military, the police were ready. Tahrir Square was blocked by rows 10 deep of security forces. And if the usual 10 to 15,000 activists had come out, they would have been defeated easily, because the regime was on full alert and ready. What happened on January 25th was that for the first time, ordinary people joined them. I've heard all of these great stories from the activists about how they walk down the street banging on garbage can lids, chanting, "Come down, join us, come into the streets." And then they look behind them and they're stunned, because for the first time in their lives, there were actually people behind them. They didn't know what to do, because they'd been doing this for 10 years and no one ever joined them. And this time they did. And some of the stories are even better, because in Alexandria, where you have basically a downhill path to the Corniche across on the Mediterranean, the activists saw these people behind them and decided to try and lead them to the police station, and everyone just ignored them. They just kept on walking right down to the Corniche, where they massed in the hundreds of thousands. The point is that this was fundamentally new. Why did it happen? Lots of theories, but my theory is simply that all of those ordinary people had been watching Al Jazeera. It's not Facebook, it's not Twitter. They had been watching Al Jazeera. They saw that Ben Ali could fall, and they decided that for the first time in their lives, it was worth the risk, worth the cost, to take the chance and go out and join the revolution. And they did. When they did, they basically occupied Tahrir Square after a very nasty fight with the police, held the square, and then, in a sense, they were rescued by their own incompetence, because they had no leadership. They couldn't take a deal. There was nothing where a leader, Wael Ghanem, the famous Facebook activist, he could not have come back to Tahrir and said, okay, we've got elections in 6 months, everybody go home. No, he couldn't. No one would listen to him. Nothing short of the removal of Mubarak would get people to go home. And that is why it ended the way that it did. Tunisia and Egypt, the same thing happened. The military had a decisive choice to make. They could have opened fire. They could have done a Tiananmen Square. They could have opened fire with tanks and helicopters, killed 1,000 people, and established martial law. And they chose not to, for reasons which we can debate. But once they didn't, Mubarak's fate was sealed. All that was left was the details. Now, Mubarak is forced out on February 11th. When Mubarak leaves, what I described before about this wave of expectations around the Arab world, well, that looks like the kiddie pool now, compared to what happens next. Because what happens next is that before, everybody thought that change was suddenly possible. But after Mubarak stepped down, everybody came to believe that change was inevitable. And they really believed, that every country was going to follow the same script. Tunisia and Egypt had the exact same script. You had the people coming out into the streets and occupying central space. You had the army refusing to open fire. The president gave 3 speeches, exactly 3 speeches, and then disappeared. And it's heartbreaking now to remember. Syrian activists used to laugh and joke after Bashar al-Assad gave his first speech. Their response was, oh, that's number 1, only 2 speeches to go. Because they believed so deeply that this script was going to be repeated. And what this meant was that you saw this wave of protest break out across the entire region. The month of February of 2011 and into the beginning of March was one in which you had, I think, a unique moment in the history of the modern Middle East. Bigger than what you saw in the 1950s, of a unified Arab public moving all at once. To me, the iconic image of the Arab Spring is on one of those Fridays in February, Al Jazeera would show this split screen, and they would show demonstrators protesting in multiple cities simultaneously, live. And you would see people in Tunis, not Tunis, they're already done, in Yemen, in Morocco, in Syria, in Jordan, in Egypt. They would be marching simultaneously, chanting the same slogans and holding the same signs. Shah, Yurid, Iskat, Nizam, the people want to overthrow the regime. And they would be chanting it simultaneously in 6 different cities. And then they would do a flip screen and show 6 different cities. And live, the same chants, the same slogans. It was unified in a way that it never was before. Now, this, as I said, is unique. And it ends by the middle of March of 2011. How does it end? I think it ends because the conservative forces in the region strike back. Saudi Arabia is the key. In Saudi Arabia, there are protests called for a day of rage in Saudi Arabia. A few days before the day of rage, the king goes on television and gives, it's very unusual for him, and gives a speech where he basically, it's the rough equivalent of throwing money out of a helicopter. He basically offers over $100 billion in public spending to people. That's the carrot. And then, when people show up for protests, they're immediately arrested and treated horribly. That's the stick. On the day of rage, only 1 poor soul shows up. He's immediately arrested, and he stays in jail for over a year. As soon as Saudi Arabia has consolidated its home front, a few days later, its tanks roll in to Bahrain next door. Bahrain was the little island off the coast of Saudi Arabia, connected by a causeway. At the peak of its protests in late February, more than half of the citizen population of the country was in the streets protesting. I mean, try to imagine that. More than half of the citizens of the country were in the streets protesting. And that was crushed. Absolutely crushed. They came close to a deal on constitutional reforms. They came close, but they didn't get there. And on March 14th, tanks roll in. Bahraini forces clear the streets by force. They bulldoze Pearl Roundabout, which is where the protests were. That was the home base of the protest. And they begin a massive campaign of arrests and repression. Truly massive. Hundreds of people are detained without lawyers. Horrible acts of torture, all without accountability. People arrested, deported, fired from government jobs, expelled from universities, all with a deep sectarian edge. So 2 things are important. The first is that this was the first fully mobilized Arab Spring country to lose. The first one where the regimes managed to crush a rebellion, and they did, full stop. They destroyed it by force. The first one to show that this script was not inevitable. It also introduced sectarianism. Up until Bahrain, it was the people against the regimes. The Bahraini regime turned it into a Sunni-Shiite question. Sunnis against Shiites. That divides people. It tears them apart. And Bahrain was extremely important because it showed that the people could lose, and it showed that sectarianism could be used to divide the people. Now, personally, I believe that this came at the cost, over the longer term, of the end of the Bahraini monarchy. I don't believe that Bahrain can survive as a country. And I think this is extremely important for the United States, because we have our Navy is based there. And it might be interesting for the Italian Navy as well, I don't know. But I don't think that, that Bahrain can survive in its current form, because they went too far. They killed and tortured too many people, and I'm very pessimistic about Bahrain. But Bahrain was a crushing blow. Then, at almost exactly the same time, it's important to remember that this is all happening in the span of about 1 week. Saudi Arabia does not have a revolution. Bahrain is crushed. Libya, the United Nations intervention begins. Now, Libya is an intervention which I actually strongly supported. I believed at the time that if Gaddafi had been able to kill his way to survival, it would have sent a message to every other Arab leader that killing your people is the way to survive. You could be stupid, like Hosni Mubarak, or you could be smart, like Muammar Gaddafi. That would be the message which would have been sent at that time. And at that time, there was very strong support in the Arab world for the intervention. I never believed that I would live to see the day, less than a decade after the invasion of Iraq, that Arab publics would be chanting for a NATO intervention. I never would have believed that, and yet it happened. Now, you get the intervention. It's one that I supported, and I believe that ultimately it will be vindicated. I think Libya is going to have a very bright future. But at the time, what it meant was that instead of a popular, peaceful change from within, now you have an international military intervention. The screens of Al Jazeera are now filled with scenes of bombing, men in pickup trucks shooting each other, a very different sense of possibility. At almost the exact same time in Yemen, peaceful protest movement had been developing with great force. Government snipers opened fire on students at the University of Sana'a. And you can still see this on YouTube. You can Google it. You can see these images. Over 50 kids are killed in cold blood. And you can see them holding up their signs, and they fall over dead. And this was a galvanizing moment. A major part of the Yemeni army defects and turns its guns against the regime, and Yemen shifts from the people against the regime to a standoff between two sides of the Yemeni military. The peaceful protesters continue, but it's fundamentally changed. Yemen goes into a deep existential crisis, governance collapses, there's a humanitarian catastrophe, famine, no access to water. Basically, governance collapses in the country until finally, after much effort, the president is convinced to leave and a transition begins. But again, all in 1 week, you get Bahrain, you get Libya, you get Yemen, and this is the exact same time that the first protests begin in Syria, in Daraa, in the south, and are met with brutal force by the regime. And so Syria then becomes part of this counter-narrative. Peaceful, hopeful change, negative descent into war, barbarism, anarchy, chaos. It takes the winds out of the sails of much of this Arab Spring. And so basically from March onward, you see the fragmentation of the Arab uprisings. You see people retreating back to their own countries, their own concerns, and you see the end of this expectation of peaceful, easy change. But what you do not see is an end to this new political culture of contention and dissent. You do not see a return to the kind of quiet, calm, non-political countries which had dominated the Middle East before. Instead, what you see is endemic turbulence across the region, which continues to the present day. And again, I could go country by country, but I think I want to stop soon so we have plenty of time to discuss the individual cases. But you can look country by country, and what you will see is that whether you have a transition or do not have a transition almost doesn't matter. Because increased popular contention and increased public turbulence is the story in almost every Arab country. So take Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a country that did not have a revolution and has not had a transition. It's the absolute foundation of the conservative order in the Middle East. And you should say, well, you know, they're back to business as usual, right? But no. Look at what's happening in Saudi Arabia today. There are now over 3 million people in Saudi Arabia using Twitter. Twitter has become the free media in Saudi Arabia. And on Twitter, they openly discuss absolutely everything. Royal corruption. You couldn't talk about royal corruption 3 years ago. And now everybody talks about it openly. You've had rolling protests and violence in the Eastern Province, the Shia Eastern Province of Saudi Arabia, for going on 2 years. You have protests in extremely conservative Sunni areas like Buraidah. You have civil rights and human rights activists in Riyadh protesting in front of police stations demanding the release of prisoners. This is unthinkable in Saudi terms, and yet it's happening. And I believe, in fact, that it's only the very beginning. The Saudi leadership is old, divided, and they all keep dying, one after the other. Eventually, they're going to run out of 75-year-old crown princes, and they're going to have to shift to a younger generation. And what happens then? Nobody knows. Part of their survival strategy in Saudi Arabia was to send hundreds of thousands of students abroad to study at universities. That's great, actually. It's actually one of the best things that they've ever done. They're giving a world-class education to men and women, Sunnis and Shiites, and they're doing something truly great for the country. But you know what? Those hundreds of thousands are all starting to come back. And the women expect to be able to drive. And they all kind of want to get jobs. And they want to be able to speak in public. And this generational change is not going to go away. I told Lorenzo in that interview that I actually see Saudi Arabia, despite its not having had a revolution, as one of the countries that has changed the most in the last 2 years. Kuwait, you had protests in the streets, and you had the parliament actually had to be dissolved. The prime minister, who is a close relation of the Amir, is forced from power for corruption. This is a radical change in the nature of politics at the heart of the conservative monarchies of the Gulf. Meanwhile, if you go over to North Africa, Egypt is, obviously the center where everybody focuses. I'm actually more optimistic about Egypt than most people. I think that it's been a horribly mismanaged transition. Almost everything that could go wrong has gone wrong. There's truly frightening polarization between Islamists and secularists. Everything has gone wrong in Egypt. And yet, if you go to Egypt and you look at this vibrant public, everyone in the streets protesting, the newspapers covering everything, you get a very strong sense of a society which is moving towards something better. I actually believe that the Muslim Brotherhood winning elections and then failing is one of the best things that could have happened to the Middle East. Not just to Egypt, but to the Middle East. Before Tahrir Square, the Muslim Brotherhood was in the shadows, viewed as clean, honest, the major alternative, and now they're widely viewed as incompetent, divisive failures. And they're going to be punished for it. I mean, it would help if the opposition would actually compete in the elections, and hopefully they will. But the point is that over the longer term, the Muslim Brotherhood has been turned from a seemingly all-powerful secret society into a normal political actor. The future of Egypt is not Islamist. The future of the Middle East is not Islamist. The future of the Middle East is contentious politics in which the Muslim Brotherhood will play an important role. And that's the big difference. The same thing in Tunisia. Libya is going to do well. I'm actually quite happy about the prospects of both the Gulf and North Africa over the 5 to 10 year span. But where I'm not optimistic is in the Levant. Because of Syria. Because the war in Syria has also gone as badly as we could possibly have feared, and in some ways even worse. There was some hope early on that, and I certainly believed in my policy writing, I tried to push for some kind of negotiated transition, some kind of political agreement by which you could have a move away from Assad to a more democratic Syria. But that chance is now gone. What we have in Syria today is a full-scale civil war, which is being fueled from the outside on both sides, with the Iranians and other allies pouring money and guns into the Assad regime, and the outside actors like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and increasingly Europe and the United States pouring money and guns into a fragmented, divided opposition. We've seen this story before. It doesn't end well. I think that Syria is going to be in a state of civil war and anarchy for the next decade. And Syria is at the very heart of the Middle East, of the Levant, and it is impossible for that to not have wide-ranging impact on Lebanon, which has huge numbers of Syrian refugees. Jordan, where the number of Syrian refugees is approaching 10% of its entire population. In Turkey, which by conservative estimates has over 1 million refugees already across its border. And on Iraq, where increasingly the Sunni areas of Iraq and the rebel-controlled areas of Syria are increasingly a single area. So what happens in Syria is both unlikely to get better anytime soon, and is likely to affect its neighbors in highly negative ways. If you add on to that the likelihood that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will remain unresolved, and I think it's quite likely that at some point in the next 2 to 5 years you will see the collapse of the Palestinian Authority for one reason or another, you add that element of instability into the region, and I see the Levant, the center of the Middle East, as likely to be in a hopeless condition of chaos and anarchy for quite some time. And then you're left with this picture of North Africa becoming increasingly democratic, presumably increasingly integrated with Southern Europe, hopefully, if Italy and Southern Europe can get their economic act together, become a powerful magnet for trade and investment across the Mediterranean. The Gulf increasingly facing popular protest and mobilization, particularly as oil and gas prices go down and they have more trouble, kind of buying off their population, and the Levant in anarchy. That's not perhaps the most hopeful picture, but it's also not, I think, the picture of complete and total despair with which so many of us are now left. And so I think I'll end my opening remarks with that kind of guarded optimism combined with apocalyptic despair, and move to our discussion. Thank you.